Yes, like for the conduct of monetary policy, inflation expectations are, of course, critically important. They determine realized inflation through the new Keynesian-Phillips curve. They matter also for the effectiveness of monetary policy transmission. And like at the individual level, if I think that prices will go up in the future, of course, I should go out and purchase before actually prices indeed have risen. So now, of course, to kind of use inflation expectations potentially as a policy tool via monetary policy communication, the first necessary step is understanding how people actually form expectations. And actually, so starting in 2015, we've been actually eliciting through our own inflation expectations survey for a broad cross-section of Americans, about 25,000 Americans, over time, quarterly, just simply how do they form expectations? Do they use their inflation expectations for making consumption savings decisions? But crucially also, if central bankers were able to reach those people, which type of communication is most effective in actually shifting people's inflation expectations? It's one of the key first findings we actually find in our research is that most Americans actually don't know what actually an inflation target is. So if you would elicit and ask them what do you think is the inflation rate the central bank tries to achieve over longer periods of time, there's a subset of the population, maybe about 20%, that actually has somewhat well-anchored expectations, but there's also a far right tail of about 40% that actually think that the Fed tries to achieve an inflation of more than 10% over longer periods of time. Now, of course, this then also potentially means that there's huge cross-sectional implications in terms of consumption and wealth inequality, because if I expect really, really high inflation, I might actually just go out and consume too much and save too little, which of course then would be crucial to understand also the wealth inequality implications of that. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So empirically, the fact that inflation expectations are so dispersed and somewhat away from the inflation target already indicates that the current conduct of communication doesn't seem successful in reaching broad subsets of the population. So in a series of papers, we try to understand how potentially communication could be more effective, and there's actually three ingredients that we document. First, the role of the message. Second, the role of the medium. And third, the role of the messenger. So let me elaborate a little bit more on each of these points. So in one paper, we document that, at least in a US setting, purely relying on the news media for the transmission of your policy message might actually hinder your effectiveness. Because in the US, you have actually that newspaper, traditional print media, rank really, really low in terms of credibility as a news source for macro and monetary economic news. And so what we find is if you provide households information from, let's say, the official FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee that is responsible for setting interest rates in the US, their statement, and compare how people react instead to reading an official coverage of that meeting in the newspaper, which is, shorter, less dense, and easier to digest, you do see that people react way stronger to the FOMC statement relative to the coverage in the news media. Now, of course, the biggest challenge then for central banks is no one tends to read official FOMC statements, while people sometimes still read newspapers, but often skip also about the economics part. So how could we then potentially reach people? And that's actually then, I come back to that point at the end. So the second then point we document is that also the message matters. In a simple survey that we did in Finland, we actually kind of again did a simple survey experiment where you actually just split your survey population into different groups and can actually show that if a central bank, in our case it was Olli Rehn, and we used in tweets from his official Twitter account, if they actually use simple messages that actually talk about the aim of a policy, in our case it was don't be worried, the central bank will do whatever it takes so that no Finn is actually worse off because of the pandemic, versus instrument communication, so specifying we have now this very big asset purchase program. People reacted quite strongly to just simply saying, well, don't you worry, versus they reacted not at all in their expectations to this more technical in nature type of statement about the specific instruments via which this target was implemented. So this is then the second point, that the kind of message also matters. And the last point, actually, in a more recent work with co-authors in the US, what we document is that if you provide identical information to like 10,000 Americans, and you just simply vary the identity of the policymaker that you show in the survey next to those forecasts, we see that women and black survey participants react way more strongly to an identical forecast if it is associated with a female or a black male policymaker relative to like a white male policymaker. So like, we document that women and black survey participants become way more trustful in the institution, the Fed in our case, and actually also are more likely to actively acquire information about monetary policy when they see a diverse policymaker being part of this important committee. So like, to wrap up, so like, the medium, the message, and the messenger, all three matter for the effectiveness and to the extent to which people incorporate information into their own subjective expectations about inflation. But then, of course, like as we discussed at the beginning, we have to figure out how we can actually reach people. And so like here, I think, more innovative forms of engagement are certainly called for. Like, think about what the Central Bank of Jamaica is doing. They've recorded reggae songs with a national reggae hero, having a song about price stability, why low inflation is desirable, why you don't want to have deflation. The Cleveland Fed has engaged like in simple videos they post on their website, initially with a little Lego man and actually talking about price stability. But of course also like, what the Croatian National Bank is doing. Like, you have a governor, this is very visible, talks to people, is in the media, and just actually tries to explain like, inflation is not the price change of particular goods, so like milk. Inflation is the average increase in price of a broad-based bundle. And because in the data we do see people tend to extrapolate from price changes of very peculiar salient goods to overall inflation. Now, that might explain why already in the last summer in the US we saw this big spike in inflation expectations, even though like, policymakers still kept actually telling us that inflation is transitory and the initial price spikes are in very peculiar, narrow categories like rental cars. But if this is now a category that's very salient, we all travel, we started traveling again last summer, then you actually want to rent a car and you see like prices went up like crazy. You start indeed actually thinking that inflation is 15-20%, even though measured inflation was still definitely in the single digits, maybe 5-6%. So like, I think those are the key things to think about. What can be be innovative ways to, reach people. I know, unfortunately, it hasn't happened, but so like the Cleveland Fed, Loretta Mester, the president of the Cleveland Fed, at some point at least was thinking of recording a rap video with LeBron James. So imagine like a white woman and a tall black basketball player rapping about price stability. I actually, I did a little kind of survey with like my haircutter in the US and like people in the supermarket and say, well, do you know what an inflation target is? No idea. Would you care hearing about it if LeBron James would rap about it? Everyone said, whatever he does, I listen to. So like, maybe trying to borrow kind of media presence via influencers that actually have credibility with broad and ordinary Americans, the broad population, could be potentially a way of trying to achieve this goal.